Hello, hello. All right, we're going to begin. I'm Victor from the Aarhus chapter of the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm going to be giving this teaching today entitled, What is Society and What is Its Crisis? And I think that's all I have to say about any of this. And we'll begin with a little video presentation.
Excuse me, I was waiting here.
Where? I didn't see you.
I've been standing here for the last 10 minutes.
I won't be long.
That's not the point. The point is, I was here first.
Well, if you were here first, you'd be holding the phone.
You know, we're living in a society. We're supposed to act in a civilized way. Does she care? No. Does anyone ever display the slightest sensitivity over the problems of a fellow individual? No. No. A resounding no.
Hey, sorry I took so long.
Oh, that's okay, really. Don't worry.
All right. In 2015, at the beginning of the age of Trump, a meme first appeared depicting the Batman villain, the Joker, with a caption, "We live in a society." I'd originally taken it as a joke on the false profundity of the Joker character and more generally on Nolan's Batman movies as a mere statement of fact. We live in a society. Or perhaps on that of Jack Snyder's Joker saying, we live in a society where honor is a distant memory, but here reduced to its basic component, we live in a society. It is in fact, according to the meme experts, partly a reference to the Chinese restaurant episode of Seinfeld where George Costanza, outraged that a woman would take his spot in line for a public telephone, exclaims, you know, we're living in a society we're supposed to act in a civilized way. Similarly, the Joker meme took aim at gamers. That was the point of the memes. It was around Gamergate, outraged that jocks get all the girls and that they must remain, as the phrase went, involuntarily celibate, incels. The law of the jungle had replaced the decency and fairness one should expect from society. At the same time, in both cases, that self-righteousness sense of outrage is ridiculed. This is just not how the world works. Society owes you neither a seat at the table, a telephone, or a girlfriend. Your expectations of what society should be like was not disinterested as you pretended it was, but really an attempt to get your own selfish interest met. And as we know, George Costanza is quick to be outraged at the barbarism of modern society when it does not serve him, but changes his mind as soon as he can see a way to benefit from any state of affairs. And as for the Joker, he embodies sociopathy. In 1987, Margaret Thatcher said in an interview that who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families. Can you turn the volume of the microphone? It's a bit. Yeah, look, I think it's good. Bless you. So Margaret Thatcher said, who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families. More specifically, she said, I think we have gone through a period where too many children and people have been given to understand, I have a problem, it is the government's job to cope with it. Or I have a problem, I will go and get a grant to cope with it. I am homeless, the government must house me. And so they're casting their problems on society. And who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. In other words, so that's the end of the quote by Thatcher. In other words, society did not exist for Thatcher as an excuse for the lack of self-reliance of both individuals and families. That's the context in which society does not exist, right? It wasn't a sort of ontological statement. She was describing a failure of the welfare state, which instead of serving as a security net to reassure people in tough times, had led to an erosion of both the individual self-reliance, but also the role of families and communities in supporting their members in times of need. People would demand handouts from the government in the name of society instead of working. Society for Thatcher, as for the writers of Seinfeld a few years later in 91, was invoked as a normative principle only to the extent that it served the responsibility of the speaker. The society thus appears both as a self-aggrandizing yet rather banal statement of fact, or as the unconvincing demand that things should change, but mostly for my benefit. Whereas for Thatcher, it was the scrounger who invoked society. In the meme world of the early Trump era, it was the sociopath. Yet in fact, Thatcher and the incels both are denouncing the breakdown of society and specifically of the family as a unit of care and support for the individual that the progressive state had apparently undermined. In 1989, right in between Thatcher's interview and the Seinfeld episode, British anthropologists debated the motion, the concept society is theoretically obsolete. And I should say I'm an anthropologist by trade, so that's why I'm bringing this to the table, among other things. The motion was proposed by Marilyn Strathern, now Dame Marilyn Strathern, coming out of socialist feminism, and from the Anthropology of Papua New Guinea, and by Christina Torren, an ethnographer of Fiji, whose work draws much inspiration from ex-Marxist philosopher Merleau-Ponty. Christina Torren was my teacher, and my other teachers were students of Marilyn Strathern. So Strathern and Torren argued that the concept society is necessarily paired up with that of the individual, yet appears as its opposite. So that when society stops making sense for people, as the Thatcher quote, according to them, proved, we're left with just individuals and worse with individualism. Therefore, the concept society is obsolete theoretically because it is obsolete culturally, and it leads to undesirable results, not just the lawlessness of the market, but the repeated failure of the Labour Party to win elections. That's sort of the tenor of the motion in that debate. What was needed, they thought, was a different pair of concepts that would show the inseparability of the terms that society and individual oppose. And they proposed the terms sociality and personhood. In that same debate, the motion was opposed by G.D.Y. Peel, an anthropologist working on transformations of religious life among the Yoruba in Nigeria, and a biographer of 19th century British sociologist Herbert Spencer. And Peel argued that the motion lets Thatcher set the term of the argument, that giving up on the concept society would abandon individuals to the mercy of the state. And specifically, he reminds his audience that the concept society emerges with the rise of the bourgeoisie, in counter-distinction to the feudal state, and as a demand to be free from its whim. The concept society was not a thing out there, but an ideal invoked by the revolutionaries of the 18th century. He quoted Thomas Paine, society and government are different in themselves and have different origins. Society is produced by our wants and government by our wickedness. Society is in every state of blessing, government, even in its best state, but a necessary evil. And that was the quote. Peel went on, in the 19th century, the concept society was precisely what could enable a liberal like Herbert Spencer to resist nationalist politics, jingoistic wars, and any state project to radically change a society's culture, which he thought Thatcher's promotion of entrepreneurialism was doing. And finally, and perhaps most importantly for him, the concept society was being mobilized at the time in Poland as much as in China in the 80s, to, and I quote him, overthrow ossified state structures. And here at least it is realized how much individual formation and fulfillment has society as its precondition, not as its antithesis. So the concept there in '89 in academic circles, intellectual circles, appeared as both what enabled what Strathern called a common enemy Thatcherite philosophy by abandoning the individual to the state once it had become unconvincing, and what could yet be and was in fact being mobilized against the state, especially ossified socialist bureaucracies of Eastern Europe and Asia. Marion Strathern registered the obsolescence of the term, Peel its normative value. As Strathern herself recognized in the Q&A that followed the debate, it was in the name of a Durkheimian notion of society that she was appealing against society, to replace it with another concept that would do the same work without being so abstract or so easily counterposed to the individual. As for Peel, in a more perhaps Weberian vein, the value of society resided precisely in it being an abstraction, an ideal type for scientists that was also an ideal for countless people. In 1991, the year of the Chinese restaurant episode, Argentinian left Peronist Ernesto Laclau wrote a short text entitled "The Impossibility of Society." The text is concerned more with clarifying a shift having taken place in the past decade than it is with justifying that shift. According to him, we used to think that the meaning of any social process could be related to a system of relations that was located outside of that social process, as a necessary form of appearance relates to an essence in Hegel. Nowadays, however, and I quote him, against this essentialist vision, we tend to accept the infinitude of the social. That is, the fact that any structural system is limited, that it is always surrounded by an excess of meaning, which it is unable to master, and that consequently, society as a unitary and intelligible object which grounds its own partial processes is an impossibility. The obsolescence of the concept society for Marxists and post-Marxists, according to Laclau, came about as the result of two processes. First, that the gap between the form of appearance and the supposed social reality underlying it grew so wide that those tasked with relating them appeared increasingly as a self-serving enlightened despots, right, the party. Second, that the social agents of late capitalism came to know themselves as, and I quote him, nothing but the unstable articulation of constantly changing positionalities. End of quote. The critique of ideology, according to him, should not concern the falseness of forms of appearance, but that of any essentialist concept of society, right? So that the critique of ideology sort of gets inverted rather than relating ideological contents to a real social substrate. It's really any claim to a real social substrate that should be criticized as ideological. As we know from Laclau's work, all that exists are temporary and limited forms of identification, usually related to demands against the state, to be articulated together pragmatically as the people against the elite, when election time comes. In other words, what had really shifted that made the concept society impossible and to which Laclau thought theory ought to be adapted was the organization of what the Frankfurt School called the rackets, a shift from national workers to a plurality of identities and their attendant NGOs. And of course, this would come to be the sort of theoretical foundation for a vast swath of new political parties of the millennial left, from Podemos to whatever Mélenchon has been trying to do and so on. 8 years before, 10 years before, in 1981, Gillian Rose articulated Durkheim and Weber's concept of society and the sociological project as a whole, which she characterized as neo-Kantian and counterposed them to Hegel's. Her aim was to interrogate the new left's turn to sociology, and in the late 70s, especially to Kant, often in the name of anti-totalitarianism, that is, of anti-Stalinism. This was perhaps most clear in the work of Habermas after the death of Adorno, And she had written her PhD thesis about Adorno. But it was just as much an interrogation of her PhD supervisor's intellectual and political trajectory, Leszek Kolakowski, that had led him from Stalinism through an anti-Stalinian Hegelian Marxism, which he called Marxist humanism. And this is what we in Platypus read from mostly when we read the concept utopia, the concept of the left, sorry. And from that Marxist humanism to an anti-Marxist and an anti-Hegelian history of Marxism. So in that text, Hegel contra sociology, she argues that the two sociological traditions inaugurated by Durkheim and Weber, that I've partly introduced already when discussing Marilyn Strathern and Peel, present us with two halves that never really make a whole. Society as that which produces individual consciousness, and society as a common project of individuals, to simplify greatly. By taking one of these two concepts of society for granted, Weber and Durkheim could each show the ironies and unrealized potentials that lie in the other. Otherworldly asceticism for Weber turns into purely immanent search for profit, while for Durkheim, social disintegration and anomie could prefigure a radically new form of solidarity and integration. This is better than the attempts to reconcile the two by Parsons, Althusser, Niklas Luhmann, Bourdieu, or Giddens, which inevitably evacuate the possibility and crisis of freedom, the freedom of society, the freedom in society, for Gillian Rose. Perhaps these ironies and squashed potentials were easier to notice for those whose lives were contemporary with the Second International than for those for those tottering in its ruins, in the ruins of the Second International. And that is Talcott Parsons, Althusser, Luhmann, Bourdieu, Giddens. Sociology and socialism come out of the crisis of society in the aftermath of the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century. Society was a concept of the third estate, of those in whose name the bourgeois revolutions were led, descendants of serfs who had emancipated themselves by selling their labor on the market. They had over time radically transformed European society. They had invented society as such, as the mutual interdependence of all, mediated not by command or tradition, but by work and desire. The lords and the church that used to rule their lives were increasingly at their mercy, having indebted themselves to craftsmen and traders to finance their wars and their courtly lifestyle. Finally, they forced the last remnants of feudalism to conform to this new state of affairs. They made the state obey society rather than the other way around. They dissolved the guilds that were restricting the freedom to work. They replaced the cult of revelation with that of reason. They abolished slavery until they could not. The return of slavery and of despotism, the emergence of unemployment and a new form of state prompted what appeared at first as a redoubling of the same efforts, socialism and sociology, to make of society both the subject and object of power and knowledge and overcome society's crisis. In both cases, what was at stake, so in both cases, the case of socialism and sociology, what was at stake was the possibility for society to be adequate to its concept. Auguste Comte invented the concept of sociology in the early 19th century. It was to form part of a new form of thought, positivism, which he called systematized socialism, and hoped would be more appropriate to the society of his time than what he called the metaphysical thought of the 18th century. That is, thought was for Comte a product of society that could be appropriate to a certain moment of history, and thanks to its own success, be overcome by that society itself. Metaphysical critical thought was necessary to overcome feudalism, but its abstractness and negativity, which were the very tools that allowed it to overcome feudalism, had proven unable to help create the institutions and morality of post-feudal society. The crises of French society since the revolution of 1789, the repetition of the revolution and of authoritarianism all the way to 1848, as well as the growing antagonism between workers and bosses, were for Comte the symptoms of that crisis. Elaborating an adequate concept of society, which also meant an adequate concept of history, was for Comte the key to recognizing the nature of these crises and to offering up a solution. The intellectuals gathered around the positivist project should offer to support the workers in their struggle against the bosses in order to ally themselves to the working class. Through this alliance between intellectual and workers, society could reform itself in a concrete way, rather than being reformed from above in an abstract way. And as Comte's master Saint-Simon had first prophesied, the government of men could be replaced with the administration of things. Herbert Spencer, a contemporary of Karl Marx, put a stronger emphasis than Comte on the history of society as a history of struggle between societies, turning into the incorporation and domination of some societies by other societies. Ultimately, only contemporary society, the society he called industrial because it foregrounded work over warfare, fully embodied the concept of society as such, that of integration on the basis of differentiation, that of the mutual dependence of all upon all on the basis of the division of labor. The history of society until then had been the history of tribal, caste, and class struggle for Herbert Spencer. But the new society needed only struggle against regressive tendencies. These regressive tendencies were those of the state, trying to impose itself onto and over society for the benefit of an elite, but also those of utopian movements, including Comte, wanting to force society into their blueprint and into a militant, a sort of military barrack socialism. Durkheim, who comes after Herbert Spencer at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the first 20 years of the 20th century, Durkheim was concerned that industrial society would be reduced to mere economic activity, especially in Herbert Spencer's work, and to the satisfaction of individual self-interest. He would point out the wretchedness of the growing asociality of modern urban life, the life outside of social norms that led to madness and suicide. He was just as much suspicious of complaints against individualism, which often took the form at the time of anti-Semitism. Society, for Durkheim, was not a mere context for people's lives, but it constituted those lives. It provided them with their very soul, and as much with the categories by means of which the world could make sense to them. For him, individualism was the historical social achievement of the division of labor. In the discrete, silent suffering of anomie leading to suicide, as much as in the raucous mob violence of the Dreyfus affair and of growing anti-Semitism, the workers' movement and the World War, he recognized the growing pains of a society in transition. Society was on its way to fully ruling itself, but the acceleration of the division of labor in the Industrial Revolution had left social norms temporarily behind. Those norms only had to catch up. Marx was not a sociologist, but he did offer a theory of society, of society's crisis, and of the crises of the theories of society. I quote, "The history of all hitherto society is the history of class struggle," the manifesto begins, echoing Saint-Simonian historian Augustin Thierry. But it continues, this was not an obvious matter. Rather, it was the necessary form of appearance of history from within bourgeois society, and more specifically from the crisis of that society. One could see that the history of all hitherto society was the history of class struggle, because bourgeois society had put an end to all feudal, and I quote again, bourgeois society had put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, and drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervors, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. End of quote. But things had not stopped there. For a few decades before 1848, and I quote again, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, of the contradiction between the relations and the forces of production, as he would put it later on, that is, of production with itself. This crisis of society as the crisis of production was pointing towards its own overcoming, but both in theory and in practice, it shied away from this overcoming, siding time and again with one side of the contradiction against the other, or attempting to harmonize them anew, and in doing so, to merely reiterating and intensifying the contradiction. Bringing that contradiction to the consciousness of those most clearly embodying it, of those who had taken it upon themselves to solve the social questions, and of those objectively most in a position to act, so it could be consciously dealt with as a contradiction, and from then on, hopefully overcome. That was the object of Marx's work. Like Comte, Marx saw the necessity of the union of workers and intellectuals in a voluntary organization that aimed at clarifying society's self-consciousness in order to help it become adequate to itself and overcome its crisis. First among all, the crisis of the state. Like Spencer, Marx saw that industrial society was both a historical achievement and society coming to terms with itself, that as such, it should not oppose, but realize individuality, and that it should defend itself against its enemy, the democratic, bonapartist, imperialist state. Like Durkheim, Marx saw that society is not external, but most intimate to the individual, and thus that its crisis affected it most intimately too. There was, as one could say, a spiritual crisis of the soul. His diagnostic of the crisis was only more specific than that of these liberal sociologists. Taking the logic of their argument of society's own thinking about itself to its limits, including by tracing out the limits of thinking about the crisis of society outside of the real movement to overcome it. He also saw the crisis of society as indeed transitional, but not merely a product of acceleration. Rather, the workers' poverty, the increasingly repressive state, and so on, were the very potential of and for a new society that the old one turned against itself to stop itself from transitioning. It required a transitory phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, where repressive forces could consciously be put in the service of the potential they used to repress. From the late 19th century to the first quarter of the 20th century, the socialist movement increasingly came to be traversed by the crisis of society as it took responsibility for seeing it through to its overcoming and ultimately succumbed to it. Out of that failure, the discipline sociology and my own anthropology, at once the sociology of the exotic and of the local, so these disciplines became prestigious institutions after the 20s, right? Before the 20s, sociology is extremely marginal, and especially after the 50s, one should say. So these disciplines become prestigious institutions, putting themselves at the service of the state and of the marketing departments of corporations, interest groups, and political parties. And the very concept, at the same time, the very concept society came to sound like a pious, empty invocation or like a fraud. The very social basis of society, the free exchange of labor on the market, had all but disappeared. The state has become the main intermediary, not only heavily regulating contracts, but also setting the price of labor directly and indirectly through command and pseudo markets. Contemporary society suffers a crisis of both integration and disintegration. Civil society is controlled by the state, which directly and indirectly funds the arts, education, sports, hobbies, friendship, thought, activism, and so on. So all activities that characterize society as such. Where some activities appear outside of the purview of the state, they rapidly demand a state takeover. Where I live in Denmark, the punk and squatting subculture of the 1980s demands recognition nowadays as a form of heritage that can keep youth out of trouble. And art exists only to the extent that it furthers the UN Millennium Goals. The state has taken control of society to stop its disintegration into anomie. And yet, this disintegration into anomie has only increased over time. Over the past few years, for instance, the past decade really, life expectancy of white men in the US has decreased due to the steadily increasing rate of deaths by suicide, alcoholism, drug overdoses, and all sorts of conditions related to these. Of which murders by the police is really another sort of after effect. Rates of labor participation are also decreasing, without this resulting from other occupations such as making and raising children. In fact, young people are not only making fewer children, they are having less and less sex. All of this precedes COVID and the Ukraine war, which intensify these tendencies by forcing people into isolation. The left has often responded to this disintegration by demanding ever more integration into society, whether via community organizing projects turned NGOs, or just as perversely through the promotion of antisocial acts that prompt an intensification of state control over social life. Intellectuals have at times recognized the problem, left intellectuals, for instance, with the deaths of despair study. And that's really a sort of made by intellectuals sociologists trying to influence the Democratic Party after 2015. So the deaths of despair study that proved the increased rate of deaths by suicide, drug abuse, and alcoholism that I just cited. But the way these sociologists propose that we should resolve this social crisis has been asinine at best. So in this case, the campaign for free healthcare and control of opioid prescriptions. Right? You might not see a reason to live, but you can't even take opioid to sort of deal with that. That diagnostic was also prompted by the immediate aftermath of Trump's election, of course. That was that very brief moment when white working class voters became important to the Democratic Party and to left-wing intellectuals. When the left briefly discovered that there exists a white working class, that it suffers, but then all of that was forgotten when the Democrats realized they could not recapture this segment of the electorate. Durkheim had a better sense of the problem when he proposed to resolve anomie through the setting up of professional organizations that would organize social life and give a moral and cultural framework to workers. The problem for Durkheim, or the problem really with the deaths of despair, is not that people accidentally end up doing and liking drugs, but that there is nothing to make their lives worth living. Of course, the Durkheim solution is also a little bit asinine. I think it's quite apparent. Anyway, the right has often taken up this diagnostic of the crisis of society and offered to remedy it less through professional organizations, although through that too, to the extent that it promotes workers' engagement, then through policies that aimed at strengthening families and communities, especially religious communities. This was the program of the much maligned neoliberalism, in fact, right? This was Thatcher's program. all the way to David Cameron's Big Society in the aftermath of the financial crisis. The contemporary left sees systematic or structural problems, not a crisis of society. What systemic and structural point to, often under the moniker of radical change or even revolution, is really the necessity of interlocking sets of policies that address together broad swaths of stakeholders and segments of the electorate, not the overcoming of capitalism, of course. In suffering, the left sees not the contemporary left sees not the symptom of repressed potential, but the opportunity to recruit members to their sect and voters to the lesser evil. At its most self-congratulatory, the millennial left's main question was, and in many ways continues to be, whether the rackets should be articulated around a populist notion of class, the Bernie Sanders option, gender, the Pussy Hat option, or race, the George Floyd option. Is the concept society theoretically and practically obsolete? Was it, along with its companions, history, progress, freedom, just a bad dream, which we would do better to forget? Or was there, in that bad dream, distorted perhaps, a wish for something better, a wish that keeps haunting our waking lives? Can we still discern in the suffering and the dreariness of the present a crisis of society that points beyond itself to a better future? Or should we opt for the solution guaranteed to limit harms and suffering, resignation to what is, as it is, resignation to the ecstasy of being, rather than the painful working through of what might become? Thank you. All right, so we have two comments by Richard. And then we have about an hour for Q&A, right? So I'll read the comments and the questions by Richard and try to maybe answer them. Is the crisis of the term society for those on the left not essentially anxiety about the disappearance of class as an organizational basis for the left, and doubts about the value of seizing state power? Is society not a mirror for these political problems? And why did society as a category not trouble the early 20th century left? And further on, society has been counterposed to the individual, but did not the creation of the category society coincide also with another category, that of nature? How is the sense of a crisis of society related to a sense of a crisis of nature? All right. Let me think. Yeah, I think, you know, what I was trying to set up is precisely how society comes to the fore once socialists, or once the Second International sort of starts disintegrating. That predates the disappearance of class, or those debates about the disappearance of class in the 50s. I think already in the 30s and 40s, society starts being a problem to be addressed by intellectuals and academics, at least. But it is, of course, in the 50s that the new left especially takes on sociology as a particularly promising way of overcoming the failures and limitations of Marxism. So in that sense, for sure, right? It is out of despair that the new left especially grabs onto a certain concept of society in the new left. But at the same time, you know, Marx, or sort of the concept society, it did not trouble the early 20th century left, but it was just there. It was sort of taken for granted. it's only as an alternative to Marxism that it appears as troubling. So yes, I guess I agree with what Richard is saying over here. The crisis of nature, I mean, I'd say that's a little bit more tricky in the sense that Kant, for instance, already thought nature was an abstract metaphysical category to be given up. It wasn't, it was a category of the metaphysical era and not one that was particularly useful anymore. It wasn't a scientific category, whereas society was a scientific category that was both, natural in that sense and not natural, right? That described just another level of reality that could be rationally investigated. That the very, that nature would come back, I think is something already Marx notices in Feuerbach's work and criticizes in Feuerbach's work, right? In the German ideology and in the thesis on Feuerbach, that suddenly this abstraction nature comes back to the fore, and he tries to work through that. And so it's not, yeah, the way I would put it is that the return of nature as a concept, as a sort of major category, is a sign that something went wrong in a certain way, right? Before even the nature goes into crisis or society goes into crisis. I don't know if that answered Richard's questions in any way, but he can.
Yeah, Richard, you can also, if you like, then I can give you raise your hand and then you can speak.
I don't know if he can hear you, but Richard, you can raise, and anyone on the Zoom, you can raise your hand, and we can make you speak to everybody. But in the meantime, there's questions, I think, in the audience. Do we have someone to bring a microphone around? Oh, is there another microphone? Yes, there is a microphone. So. It does, yeah.
Hello, Ephraim from London. Thanks very much for the teaching. I just wanted to sort of observe for platypus, I think you did a good job kind of threading together the what is society reading group. And I guess more than a question, I really just wanted to mark that it's a summer reading group which deals least explicitly with Marxism or the left, really of any summer reading group probably that we've ever done. And as was evident from your talk, it also engages more closely with the way the so-called right or avowed right has been dealing with neoliberalism, so Thatcher, and then its crisis more recently. And there's a whole spectrum of symptoms there. And also, of course, it's more academic. It's largely based on a syllabus that is taught by founding members of Platypus at the University of Chicago. It's kind of part of the core. In that sense, it comes out of precisely that turn to sociology, what you described about the sort of sociology becoming a dominant discipline in American academia in the 1950s. But it's also about, I think, one of the things that Chris and Spencer were discussing around the reading group was the way that Moshe Postone had to kind of, was not allowed into the sociology department, had to become a sort of historian as an ersatz sociology, like where does Marxism fit into the academy? So I just wanted to kind of mark that as a problem for Platypus, because I think this is something we're going to sort of investigate throughout the weekend, is can we really engage the left on this question? Or is it kind of too orthogonal in a certain sense? And I think that a related symptom is the issue of the 80s, 90s post-political left. So the primary left symptoms in your talk were 80s, 90s, even starting with Gillian Rose in 81 through to the anthropologists and Ernesto Laclau. And you know, I was just listening to Andreas's interview on the podcast with the Italian kind of Gen X, Stalinist, non-Stalinist. And so it was making me think about this problem of how we kind of can leverage the symptoms of the post-political left, why that's coming back now, and how it seems even a kind of step further degraded from the new left. And I think what, like Richard's question about class and the disappearance of class and the stuff about Stalinism and anti-Stalinism, that's much more, so much more acute in the new left in the kind of 56 to 1970 period, or even a bit later. So yeah, there isn't really a question there, but I think I just wanted to kind of mark those issues that are coming up of the departure from a kind of, the departure to a kind of more academic subject, and something that kind of flirts with some of these issues being taken up by the right, and the problem of the 80s, 90s, and whether, you know, how we think about that rather than the new left.
Yeah, no, I think you're right to point out, and I was thinking this yesterday when I was finishing the talk, that I sort of jump over the new left, and that's important in all sorts of ways, right? Like one misses precisely the question that Richard was raising, or like the question of class, the questions that really Adorno was also addressing in some of the texts we read on, you know, is Marx obsolete? Is this an industrial society? Is there still a class society? And I think yeah, I think the real difficulty is in, or what I tried to highlight is precisely that difficulty of addressing the left with the question of society today, when on the one hand, it's really sort of obvious. That is, people talk about society. It's a sort of, it's in popular culture. People will think about society. In Denmark, for instance, during the whole COVID crisis, the government was, but also people were calling for samfundssind, which means like a sense of society, right? A sense of civility, really. And at the same time, intellectuals shy away from addressing that question, or don't think that actually there's any substance in this, that all of this is just ideological or self-serving, and so on and so forth. And so that sociology would be the way of addressing society, the question of society and its crisis after the failure of socialism, and at the same time that sociology would be the way of avoiding that question is what's tricky, and that the left, especially the academic left, would be unable to address all of this. Yeah. Anyway, yes.
Sorry. Danny, I'm from Philadelphia. So I have a response to one of Richard's questions that will lead into my question. Because maybe in the era of the early internationals, maybe they didn't talk about society. I mean, now and then they did, but they would have just accused each other of something like idealism. So someone who would have fallen into kind of a bourgeois view of society, they would have said, oh, you're an idealist. You're kind of treating society as maybe estranged to itself, but ultimately the conscious activity and freedom of people in that sense. And hence materialism is kind of their way to try to square that circle. But this leads into actually two of my questions. So you did bring up the Margaret Thatcher quote, and I was thinking to myself, well, doesn't that sound like a perfect postmodern? That there's no society, there's only individuals, and that in a sense, her critique may, like, obviously it has roots in the New Left as well. And because she's picking up on the falseness of society, which is that it's being statified. And so in a sense, it's not really a society. And thus you did have also, I know you talked about the left in terms of kind of damaging or collapsing society through its statism. But I guess there's also this other side, which is, this rejection of any mediation. And so that then therefore means society. Society is a total fiction, and it's really just a way of kind of oppressing people to particular powers. And so one of my questions was, how do you see then the left also in terms of the rejection of society from that angle? And then
can you just repeat that, because I misheard?
Not just the, and maybe I'm cutting it too sharply, not just the kind of statist side, right, which rejects society in terms of community and collective, and civil society is a bullshit concept, this thing, but also one where it's like that kind of anarchist tendency. Or, I mean, even Sartre has this like, well, there's just, you start with, I think, therefore I am. And it's like a very individualist starting side. And then, shit, I think I forgot my second question. And then my second question, and I'll give an analogy and then you can kind of help me out on what your thoughts are on this, which is there's a title of one of Karl Korsch's book on Karl Marx. One of the chapter titles is From Political Economy to Economics. And the idea is that the crisis of society is reifying its parts. And likewise, we got that with philosophy last summer, right? Philosophy, why still philosophy? It can't even justify itself anymore. And I want to make a similar maneuver with society and sociology, but then there's this other part of me that goes, not quite the same, right? And I imagine if Durkheim was here, he would say no, because you wouldn't even be able to think without society. And so that's kind of a statement, and maybe you could comment on that of like, when we're talking about the crisis of society, we're not just, this isn't the sociology reading group, right? There was something deeper about it. And in fact, maybe the problem is that, as you were mentioning, the left goes, oh, we have to supplement Marx with sociology. It was political economy, or it was philosophy, but you also need sociology. So those were my two comments.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so the first one, the question of opposing society as in itself oppressive, and demanding or sort of tasking ourselves with escaping society, perhaps producing communities outside of this oppressive reach of society, or at least producing individuals outside of that reach, has clearly been a sort of central feature of a whole current of the left. I'm thinking more in the sort of more recent versions of this, groups like Tikkun in the sort of anti-war era, and thinkers like Agamben, right? So very intellectual movement, but it's actually also a very popular version of this, and like crime think and that sort of anarchism. Usually they do it in the name of society. Is right. That is usually ultimately they do it in the name of cooperation, in the name of a better form of society that they're trying to prefigure, which I guess we might hear about tomorrow. And the way to me this is even sort of to put that slightly more sharply, a first version of all of these ways of trying to escape society by creating, I mean, on the one hand, you have sort of the communes and these attempts to create living utopias already in the 19th century and all of this. But more pointedly here, one of the inheritance of Durkheim on the left already in the 20s and 30s is the group of people around Georges Bataille and the Collège de Sociology, who precisely tried to, to create a secret society with rituals, ritual murder, among other things, like they killed a young woman in the wood during a ritual. And that is precisely both in order to transgress the sacredness of society and to produce a better form of society. And there's something there that, actively flirts with fascism without fully going onto it. And that will serve as inspiration for, the Foucaults and Deleuze of the New Left. But it was precisely in the name of society, ultimately, right? I think that's kind of also what I've been trying to say. Like even Thatcher really is, she's arguing against society, but really it's in the name of society. She's an inheritor of the New Left also because really what she's arguing against is the elites that ultimately are profiting from the destruction of society. Right, not the ruling class, but the elites. So, yeah, I don't know if that sort of answers that first question. And then the second one, can you repeat just? Oh yeah, no, yeah, I remember. So the question of why is still society? I think if last summer the question, as you say, was why still philosophy, one of the answer was, well, actually, we still need some concept of philosophy, and we will continue to need some concept of philosophy to, continue. It is unthinkable that we may not have one. Was one sort of part of the discussion that was happening in Platypus at the time. And one could have, I think, a similar one with society. Of course, Durkheim would say, well, yes, society is thinking through you. You can't think without society. In the same way that people, some people last summer were saying you can't think without philosophy. At the same time, the answer both time was, well, maybe we can, or maybe something else will come up. Maybe the very category society or the category philosophy will transform in such a way or become irrelevant over time. I guess that's one way I would think of it. But in both cases, in both sides of those very abstract debates, no one is positing society or philosophy in the way that they are being posited by academics, professionals who have reified those concepts and emptied them largely of the substance to do really something quite different under those names, right? And I think it's perhaps clearer, no, it's perhaps just as clear, at least with sociology or anthropology, as it is with philosophy. Yeah. And Yeah, Richard is asking if a Marxist sociology is possible. And that, and again, it's kind of the same question. So clearly, there has been a Marxist sociology, there's been a Marxist anthropology. There's been a Marxist philosophy. What people have meant by these things, especially Marxist sociology and anthropology, has really been, the way I make sense of that, especially Marxist anthropology, which I know a lot better, but it was really an attempt to go back to a form of Durkheimian social science at a time when it was being discredited or when it was disappearing. So Marxist anthropology is largely an attempt to go back to like structural functionalism after Lévi-Strauss. And the Marxism in there refers to Althusser's interpretation of the German ideology as like providing new sociological categories, right, to make a typology of societies. So in that sense, clearly there's not much Marxist in there, or it's Marxist in a very superficial way. May there be a Marxist sociology or Marxist anthropology in the future? It's unclear to me what that might mean. That is, should there be academics who are Marxists and producing a sort of politically inflected version of their trade? That I'm not sure what the point of that would be.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a question as well. Ephraim raised that he wanted to mark that moment of reoccurrence of maybe like the 80s and 90s, the post-left turn right now that we see during the like complete breakup, more or less, of the millennial left. And I wanted to take that mark, which we also sort of tried to highlight during our international convention this year, that took place under the title Marxism and the Ends of Liberalism. And I wanted to bring liberalism sort of into the whole discussion of society and the discussion of the teaching, because how do these authors you discussed in your teaching and we read in our summer reading group relate to, let's say, the faith of liberalism in the 19th century? And how does, maybe just a very broad question, but how does liberalism relate, like today, relate to the failure of Marxism? Just as a very broad question.
I mean, the sort of historical one is easier. Kant would not have called himself a liberal. I don't think so. He calls himself a socialist in passing in a letter. And the extent to, the seriousness of that claim is complicated. And what he meant by socialism, just around 1848 is broader than what we would call socialism later on. That is, it's an answer to the social question and an understanding that the social question is the most important one. And the social question at the time was, the poverty of the workers, unemployment, housing, the sort of social conditions of the working class in advanced countries. But he did think, and in that sense, he's perhaps closer to socialism, to a sort of stronger concept of socialism, because he did think it was necessary for the intellectuals to ally themselves with the workers in order to transform society beyond the question of democracy, etc., which he didn't find terribly important or interesting. And in that sense, he's both, right, close to liberalism and to something like socialism. Spencer was very much an anti-socialist liberal, but his opposition to socialism was quite close to that of Marx, which is that was sort of what I was trying to mark. His critique of socialism was that of sort of barrack socialism, of militant socialism, of an attempt to transform society from above, from the state, rather than an attempt to transform the state from society. And Durkheim is where things get sort of perhaps more interesting, in that he was both very close to the socialists, yet never was a socialist. And his nephew, Marcel Mauss, who's also a prominent sociologist and anthropologist, in the 20s and 30s was very active politically in the Second International, so in the sort of post-split Second International, but as an explicitly anti-Marxist participant close to like anarcho-syndicalism, and really a proponent of the welfare state and of nationalization. So he writes a book called Socialism. I forget the exact title, but basically, even in the title and throughout the text, he equates socialization with nationalization and with a sort of positive form of nationalism that he was hoping the welfare state would produce, that individuals, by receiving from the welfare state, would recognize themselves as being indebted to the nation, and through this to society, right? Would recognize a debt to society. So the opposite of what someone like Thatcher would describe as the effects of the welfare state 50 years later. Sorry? Right. Or Spencer before, Spencer, you know, he just didn't have an idea of what that could look like. Whereas there's something, there's more of a continuity between Moses' project and what turns out to be the case. So that's the easy part, is that in many ways, Moses is actually a sort of liberal, perhaps. He's taken up nowadays by people who call themselves anarchists, like David Graeber, and who are largely, I would say, liberals. That is quite happy with like left-wing liberals. But I think things get really confusing to them, because what is liberalism today? You know, what does it look like? It's kind of, I find it at least confusing. So Richard, we're going to try to make you talk to us.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So one clarification and then one question. So on the question of nature and society, so I was thinking of two things. One is that the classic Enlightenment critique, you know, you have someone like Morelli, right, in the 18th century, and his critique of his Ancien Regime society is the opposition of like, that it's against nature, right? The opposite, in other words, nature exists in the Enlightenment also to critique society. And I would say even the concept of society becomes possible historically through the possibility of criticizing it. And that's why you don't have a society in the concept of society, not a society, before bourgeois society, because there's no theory of critique of it. And the other question that goes through your whole talk is you take for granted what seems to me an opposition between state and society. And you speak about statism and a statist left. And I guess I would sort of call that into question, sort of theoretically. I would say, doesn't the state emerge from society? Isn't the state always a reflection of society? In other words, can you, particularly from a Marxist standpoint, speak about the state as in any way independent of society? Or isn't that always an ideological illusion?
Right. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, so I quite deliberately set aside the 18th century, like I did the New Left, because the picture is indeed quite a lot more complicated in the 18th century in precisely this mutual critique of nature and society, and where society ultimately also appears as second nature and a more or less desirable second nature that might be engineered in different ways. And so that, that does continue in less explicit way through the work of those social theorists or sociologists, liberal sociologists of the 19th century that I spent more time describing. And it becomes less explicit in their work precisely because the concept of nature enters a crisis in that sense, right? In that it becomes, for someone like Comte, fully positive category rather than a critical category. So sure. The question of the state, of course, for none of them, for neither Comte nor Spencer nor Durkheim, is the state something that comes from outside of society. It is a part of society that becomes overgrown, or that is that precedes a sort of full concept of society. So for especially someone like Spencer, right, and in a way that is, I believe, not that different from what Marxists would say. The state first appears as really one society dominating another, right? Or like one class or one caste dominating another. And at the same time, as a sort of functional solution to the problems of society, as giving, as organizing and commanding society in a necessary sort of progressive way. That you have both things from the start, but that in many ways this isn't really fully, those aren't fully societies because they're really part societies oppressing and dominating each other, rather than sort of a mutual dependence. And the way Spencer, but really Durkheim especially, would describe the state as sort of nerving the entire social body, it should not be, and it should not appear as an instant separate from the rest of society. And yet it does, right? And then yet it becomes this overwhelming thing that especially pushes towards warfare or dominates the body. And so that's the way the question of the state appears to them is as one of anachronism, as anachronism or sort of pathology, as a function, as an organ that has become, that has grown beyond the needs of the organ, of the organism as a totality, and that is parasitical on it as a form of cancer, right, to be controlled. That changes after the 30s and the sort of authoritarian state moment, and for the New Left, where the state appears much more, well, you have both, right? On the one hand, the state appears as like either completely nerving society in a completely necessary way, and as really indistinguishable from society, but where it's actually society that is revealed to have only ever been the state. And that's, what you see in Foucault's work, where everything is just a sort of chain of power relations that extends throughout the social body. And that is where the very concept society is an effect of those power relations rather than a real thing that exists out there. Or the state appears as bureaucracy that completely stands outside of the social body and is largely to be limited, but it is also largely accepted. Yeah, I don't know. I'm getting confused by the end of this. Sorry. I hope that was clarifying in some way. There's 4 up there.
Yeah, thank you very much for this teaching. I hope it's not too specific of a question, but I thought that was a really interesting point when you talked about Durkheim and specifically his understanding of anti-Semitism as a modern phenomenon and how the position of the individual in modern society translates to this very modern form of anti-Semitism. And maybe I wondered if you could explain how, for Durkheim, this translates, this translation from the crisis of the individual translates to anti-Semitism, and also if it maybe can compare to a Marxist understanding of anti-Semitism, which I think also highlights this very modern character in the context of the failure of socialist politics, or more specifically in the 20th century, the failure of the consciousness for the revolutionary task of the proletariat, translating to the ultimate disaster through anti-Semitism.
Sure. I mean, I can say more easily. I can talk to the first part of that question. That is, Durkheim. Durkheim doesn't not address anti-Semitism like explicitly and directly. I don't think ever really in his work. And yet he's always that discussion becomes sort of implicitly quite clear from around the moment of the Dreyfus affair, right? When this French general who happens to be a Jew is accused of treason on trumped-up charges, and sort of French society erupts, like is sort of profoundly divided and violently divided on the question of his innocence or culpability. He's condemned, and then it becomes clear that the secret police had manufactured evidence, and he's ultimately pardoned. And some of the major architects of that whole pardon are people who are very close friends to Durkheim. And he addresses this always indirectly, like he basically is responding to people who are equating individualism with capitalism and Judaism. Like the Jews are lawless, amoral, and they're pursuing only their own self-interest against that of society, is sort of the argument that's in the air against Dreyfus, or to explain, why Dreyfus is a Jew necessarily, why the traitor has to be a Jew. And he deflects this by saying, well, let's actually, look at society, remember that individualism is an achievement of society and not its opposite. And also by looking at primitive religion, elementary forms of religious life, to show that the attribution of biological differences to social differences is something that is sort of both profoundly human and is a sort of paradox of human rationality or of social rationality. It's a sort of irrational rationality, irrational effect of rationality. That way of dealing with it is quite different from, I think, but not opposed to what a Postone, for instance, would see in like what Postone would elaborate as his critique of anti-Semitism. In that, I think Postone pushes that sort of argument further and much more explicitly. By showing or by trying to show that anti-Semitism identifies the Jew with a specific effect of the crisis of capitalism, which is sort of abstraction and abstract value and finance. And on that basis, makes of political anti-capitalism a form of political anti-Semitism. I don't know that in Postone, for instance, or elsewhere, the question is that of individualism or self-interest as such that would be identified with the Jews. That seem to have sort of fallen off a bit. Yeah, I don't know if that was satisfactory at all as a sort of answer. That was a bit meandering. I'm sorry.
Hello, it's Ephraim again. I'll be quick because I know I'm being cheeky with a second go. I just wanted to push back on something you said in response to Richard, which is that you missed out the 18th century because it's more complicated or more difficult than the 19th century. Oh, yeah. I think it maybe it's the other way around. And that in Platypus, in the primary reading group syllabus, the way we deal with a lot of these questions is in the 18th century, primarily with Rousseau. Yeah. And Rousseau is a figure who's central kind of to Platypus pedagogy and is really central to all the figures who we read in the summer reading group. You know, although very often they refuse to mention him, but he's there. And with Rousseau, what we get is the kind of way we deal with it in the reading group is this retrospectively applied antinomy of authoritarianism and anarchism, right? There's the statist Rousseau who will force you to be free, and there's the anarchist Rousseau who says man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. And that's kind of the way we're already setting up all of the kinds of antinomies that come in sociology and the concept of society in the 19th and then 20th centuries. And I think just wanted to kind of put two terms on the table. One comes from Adorno and one from Horkheimer. I think a really important concept in Adorno's essay Society, which kind of framed both ends of the summer reading group, is the idea of a tendency. That the idea of society is somehow very related to the idea that it has a tendency, and that this tendency needs to be realized, but also that this tendency is knowable in a certain way. And I just wanted to put on the table that, you know, what that raises is, again, the specter of progress versus regress, but also the question of decline that is kind of returning, particularly on the right, but also on parts of the left. And so, you know, do we still feel that we live in a society that has a tendency? And if so, is that tendency knowable? And what does that mean for the possibilities of a left that would actually seek to realize a tendency? That's something already developing in society. In that sense, it's picking up on Marx saying that we only show the world what it's already fighting for, right? The ruthless criticism of everything existing is that there's an imminent critique of a tendency that needs to become conscious of itself. The other term from Horkheimer is from one of the readings on the primary syllabus, which is the self-regulating society. And I think a lot of the problems that you raised are about the abandonment of the idea of self-regulation But obviously that also becomes problematic because you get, again, the antinomy of the state needing to regulate society, and on the other hand, a kind of anarchism which claims that we can begin to regulate society itself kind of here and now. And so what that puts on the table is a revolution that's necessary for some kind of, dictatorship of the proletariat, to have a transitional phase. And again, that kind of poses the question of state and society again through the problem of revolution. So I think one of the issues today, as with tendency, is that there's the concept of self-regulation is both kind of fetishized and lost at the same time. So I just wanted to put those out there.
Thanks, yeah.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah, because I think that was, I don't think that was a question. That was great. Yeah. Let's still.
We can change the mic.
It should be okay.
Hi, I'm Will from Boston. So my comment, it does come off of Ephraim's comments, especially his first one. I was going to ask something much more abstract, but based on the nature of the conversation, I feel like there's a fear that it's becoming somewhat of an intellectual history dialogue. And so just basically, like what are the ideological obstacles in recent years, especially on the left, as it relates to the misrecognition of society, or the inability to pinpoint, to clarify a tendency, whether it's a negative tendency or this longue durée tendency. So basically, is it simply that the left, hasn't read or isn't keeping up with their knowledge of Durkheim, of Rousseau? In other words, what are the political stakes of the left today? Misrecognition or inability to see society, not simply intellectually or historically, but politically.
Great. And I guess that actually allows me to answer to Ephraim at the same time, in that, if there is a tendency that is knowable, that is visible, is a tendency for society to stop making sense, right? For regression, both socially and intellectually. And politically, it's sort of what I was trying to address with the deaths of despair stuff. That is, sociology appears both as like a primary reference for the left, sociology and like social disciplines, as like the facts that tell us what we should do. They seem to be making a diagnosis for the crisis, saying there is, first of all, showing that there is a crisis, what it looks like and what the causes are, and then how to solve it with a set of policy, but also with various political marketing attempts at capturing segments of the population, right? So this is how sociology looks like today, but this is also how the left tends to, a part of the left at least, to think of itself, all right? It thinks of itself as having the better facts and the better policies, and at the same time as being the struggles or the discussions on the left are about deciding which set of policy alongside which segments of the electorate will be able to bring the left to power. Right, and to solve ultimately a crisis of society, because this is indeed what they do take themselves to be doing. And so in this, there is sort of vague remnant of what sociology was. At the same time, sociology always was inadequate to its own task, right? To the task that it set itself. Durkheim, when he proposes to solve the crisis of anomie, the various crises that modern society is encountering, with professional organizations that will organize, cultural festivals and morality. It's both it's an extremely ambitious vision, much more ambitious than anything we see today on the left generally, and especially among sociologists. And yet it is utterly inadequate to the task, right? It would be really nice if Durkheim was right, and yet he sort of misses, and partly voluntarily misses the point, right? It is in an attempt to distinguish himself from Marxism and from socialism that he ends up limiting the horizon of possibility for political action, right? Or actually he wants to make politics unnecessary, and that would be great. So the stakes today are the ones that sort of put forward at the end, which is that on the one hand, we can take the contemporary left to task for failing to, even in its sociologism, for failing to live up to its own sociologism, as it were, right? We can see a sort of a regression there, and we can ask them why they're not even doing this, right? Why have they reduced their ambition so much? And then there is the added question of Marxism. That is either reduced to sociology or reduced to economism, right? And therefore to not even a theory of society. And yet Marxism is neither sociology nor the other of like a materialist alternative to sociology. It's like setting up the question at a much higher level. Yeah, I don't know if that answers some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, my question follows on from Ephraim's in kind of bringing in the 18th century, but also Will's point and what you just described, the kind of positivism of the left today, which obviously relates to the 19th century in sociology. So, Richard just said, or he just asked whether it is ideological to speak of the state in isolation from society, but I was thinking you could, of course, reverse this point as well. Isn't it ideological to speak of society, to take society as an object of reflection, of knowledge, in isolation from the state as a symptom of the crisis of society, as sociology does? So, my question is, what is sociology's, or what is the 19th century's contribution to our understanding of society as distinct from bourgeois thought?
On the one hand, sure, there was like something ideological about the way sociologists try to think. But ideological in the sense of, we're normative, in the attempt of 19th century sociology to describe society partly apart from the state, right, as a sort of self-governing institution that does not require the state in order to then criticize the role of the state. It was ideological because it was presenting itself as positive, right, rather than as what it was, a sort of much more speculative move. Let us imagine that society is this self governing functional system, rather than this crisis that demands the state to rule over it. But in doing so, they were able to keep pushing for a certain understanding precisely of like a certain sort of 18th century, even if it's disguised and even if it's against their best wishes, because it defined themselves against the 18th century. They want to go beyond that metaphysical era. But even there, even in doing so, they managed to actually keep some of the most speculative moments of bourgeois thought alive all the way to the 20th century in a way that philosophy was largely unable to do, right? Like there's something in Durkheim at the beginning of the 20th century that keeps a sort of speculative understanding of religion and the state and so on, that I don't think was alive anywhere else at the time, apart from perhaps Marxism, and even then in sort of complicated forms, right? So it, you know, it serves as a sort of, like liberalism, perhaps generally, it continued as a sort of legacy of the 18th century throughout the sort of crisis of the 19th and 20th century. Yeah, I don't know if that, it preserves something, right? It's a conservative, they're conservative. Of course, you know, liberalism is in some way conservative, and these people are conservative, even in their progressivism, but they are trying to preserve what is good about society, about the concept society in an era that sees it being degraded. Yeah.
I've already micro, or are there two micros? Oh, okay. So I guess I want to come back to the question of the millennial left and the new left, or rather to different moments within those two. And to me, it seems if we talk about society, all right, kind of the end of society, the Thatcher quote, for example, it's very closely connected to, for example, the end of history, right? Or like maybe even the question of freedom. And you mentioned this quote of Thatcher, and then you mentioned this meme from 2015, which is, let's say, at least from the autumn of the millennial left. And it kind of jumps over the original moment of the millennial left and also the founding moment of platypus. And so, yeah, I wonder, like, right, we see in platypus, as we say, those different moments on the left as moments full of potential. And so how do you think that both the millennial left and the new left, let's say in its original phase, so right in the 50s and 60s and the 2000s, how were they able to grasp the concept of society, maybe of history, of freedom, differently than in the moment of their decline or even their death we are in right now?
That's tough as a question. I think, like, I don't know, the first thing that comes to mind is, but perhaps our Greek comrades would have more to say about this, is like, and based not on sort of objective importance, but based more on my own knowledge of it, is like the transition, Castoriadis and his transition from like the 50s to the 70s. In the 50s, Castoriadis is still a sort of Trotskyist, part of creates socialisme ou barbarie as an attempt to continue Trotskyism beyond its failure to turn the Second World War into a revolution. and then gradually gives up on the sort of political organization in order to preserve a revolutionary horizon, and as part of this, focuses on what he calls the imaginary constitution of society, right? And it's precisely by, like, he gives up on Marxism in order to save the revolution, and he gives up on, like, economism to keep a sort of culturalist understanding of society, or sort of a society as that which is constituted by people's intentions and collective projects. That is the sort of the trajectory that comes to mind at the moment, right? And so therefore, in the 50s, Socialisme ou Barbarie, their project is already a sort of fledgling Marxism. It's close to the Marxist humanists of Renata Dunayevskaya in the US. And yet, both in form and in content, like in the fact that it still understood itself as being a party and as or pre-party organization, and as trying to keep together both sides of that equation of sort of society as constituting individual consciousness and individual consciousness as constituting society, was nevertheless more dynamic than it became, right? And it's around and after the mid-60s, just before 68, I believe, that collapses. That's what comes to mind now. I don't know if that is so. And for the millennial left, I think it's even more obscure. I find it difficult to think of. I guess one would have to see, when does someone like Bruno Latour publish We've Never Been Modern, which is really about, like, how the concept society just doesn't make sense. But I don't know. It becomes a lot more. I don't really see. It would be even more difficult to trace. Like, in sort of what I've given of a narrative of the millennial. I don't really talk much about the millennial left, in that those who talk about society is the millennial right, largely. As a sort of, it's like popular culture as not really being political at all, right? Up until the sociologists of the Bernie Sanders era. So I don't know. It's a good. I see your point, and it's a good point. But I'm unsure how to really answer it for the millennial left in terms of the intensification of the disappearance of the question of society.
Thanks, Victor. It's David from Manchester. I've got 2 points. So firstly, on responding slightly to Ephraim's first question, marking the moment in Platypus, but also responding to this question of the 18th century. And I think it's been said before, but why not, what is bourgeois society? What does it say about the absence of this kind of common platypus black box term, bourgeois society, that we're now talking about what is society? And my second point, what was my second point? I'm sorry, I've forgotten what my second point was now.
Let me begin with the first one, and maybe you can remember the second one. So society is bourgeois, or like, you know, part of what I was saying is that the concept society is bourgeois, and to call it bourgeois society seems to be sort of belaboring the point. The reason why we call it bourgeois society is because society, at the same time as it is a bourgeois concept, appears as a trans-historical concept, so that then we can clarify that there is like the historicity of the concept society. At a time when it stops, when that historicity was pretty obvious to most 18th century thinkers that we read, especially. But it stops being that obvious, and it sort of appears as a naturalized object, especially for sociology, right? And Marx, in the parts of the manifesto that I quoted, just as he reasserts society as an apparently trans-historical object, so that the history of all society is the history of class struggle, almost immediately says, well, actually, it's only from a specific moment in history that this looks this way, and therefore it was bourgeois society that gave us this, and so this is that's one of the ways in which Marxism is sort of more specific, acutely aware of the historicity of all of this, and that allows Marxism to criticize both socialism and sociology, and in the way that they reify the object society, and at the same time that, yeah, I forgot what I was going to say as well.
Sure. If we have time, I have a.
If you remember your second question, yeah, or
yeah, responding to the kind of millennial left comments, and also to Richard's point about nature. I mean, a simplistic but relevant, contemporary relevant reading of that question, regards, we've all met people who are saying, I'm not going to have children, I'm worried about ecological catastrophe. The crisis of nature is related to the crisis of society in the minds of the millennial left generation and inheritors in the kind of Gen Z era. So I guess I just wanted to make that point and just see if you had any responses to that.
Yeah, sure. And, and also in the way that they think of, like, even the more optimistic ones. So I remember last year I was at a talk by the IMT in Copenhagen about the ecological crisis and how the revolution is going to solve it all. Because or as part of that talk, I raised the point that if it became a lot less expensive, a lot less difficult materially to bring up children, people might actually end up having a lot more children. And therefore that a communist revolution might end up accelerating an environmental catastrophe, right? And they were largely unable to even, their response, the immediate response was, but we know that when populations get richer and more educated, they have fewer children, right? That is, we have those statistical, sociological studies of demographic transition that show that actually this is done, and now everybody is going to have 2.3 or between 1.5 and 2.3 children, right, for the rest of history, because that's what happens when you learn how to read. And clearly, that's just absurd. But so in there's a way in which they do relate these crises, but in very sort of one-sided ways, either as society is destroying nature and society should subordinate itself to nature, or rather either by demanding that society be subordinated to nature, or by expecting society to already be actually a natural object that obeys quasi-physical laws, right? That will be that cannot change. Yes, I don't know if that's sort of what that brings to mind.
All right. Okay. So thanks a lot, Victor, for doing the teaching and the discussion.
Thank you.